Scientists don't understand it. Philosophers have argued about it for centuries, and somehow it is still happening to you right this very moment. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, consciousness. What, where, and how the hell is consciousness? Welcome to a cup of Dhamma. Get yourself something warm to drink, crank up your consciousness to high, and let's dive straight in. I remember sitting in a neuropsychology lecture, and the lecturer landed on a slide showing a drawing of a brain with the title something like The Brain and Consciousness. And my attention immediately went from admittedly about 20 to 110. And I thought, oh, this should be good. He looked out at the room and said something like, so, consciousness, how does this wobbly mass of gray cells, this gelatinous blob we carry around in our skulls, generate consciousness? Short answer, we have no idea. And most likely we never will. And that was the end of the story. Next slide, moving on. It had taken about 10 seconds. I was a bit stunned because here was someone who genuinely knew brains. And the most honest thing he could say about the relationship between the brain and conscious experience was, we have absolutely no clue. I just hadn't known before then how utterly in the dark we were on this topic. It's what the philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems are things like observing how we react to stimuli, what part of our brain lights up in response to joy or pain, which brain areas vibe with each other. Science is pretty good at that. The harder question is, why does any of it feel like anything? Why is there something it is like to be you, sitting here right now, watching this video? That gap between the physical and the experiential, between the objective and the subjective, remains completely unexplained. No scientist has ever located consciousness itself in a brain scan. What they find is always activity, electrical patterns, chemical signals, never the experience itself. Nonetheless, there are a few thinkers worth knowing about on this topic. The most relevant for our purposes is British neuroscientist Anil Seth. He calls conscious experience a controlled hallucination, which sounds a bit alarming, but bear with it. His point is that the world we perceive is not a direct window onto reality, it's a construction. The brain is literally in a black box, the skull, so it can't directly experience what's out there. Instead, it's constantly making predictions based on incoming sensory signals and updating those predictions in a feedback loop. What we experience as reality is basically the brain's best guess. A highly sophisticated guess, but a guess nonetheless. Then there's Baroness Susan Greenfield, who I want to mention because her central image is so vivid and useful. She proposes that when a sense object makes contact, so when something's seen, heard, felt, for example, neuronal activity briefly synchronizes into a temporary coalition in that part of the brain that has been addressed by the stimulus, and then disperses again. And the size of that coalition, which she calls a neuronal assembly, corresponds to the richness of the conscious moment. The stronger the stimulus, the wider the spread of synchronized activity, like a stone thrown into a pond, with ripples spreading outward from the point of impact. Small stone, barely a ripple. Big stone, strong ripple. Now, here's the key point about all of this. Every neuroscientist will agree that the brain's activity correlates with consciousness. When you damage specific brain regions, specific aspects of experience change. When the brain is more active, consciousness seems richer. The correlation is real, What no one can tell you is how, whether the brain is actually generating consciousness or whether it's doing something more like receiving it. On a side note, it took me many years to arrive personally at the view that the mind is not simply the brain and its processes, but I'm there now. And a chat about the mind itself will also be in the works soon. Before we get into the Buddhist picture, a quick word on method. The kind of investigation the Buddha and the Ajahns are doing is not ordinary introspection, not just sitting and thinking about your thoughts. In the deep states of meditation known as Jana, the mind becomes extraordinarily still and clear. Sensory input disappears. The noise of ordinary mental activity disappears. And in that stillness and laser-sharp focus, aspects of mind become visible that are completely invisible in ordinary waking consciousness. It's like a lake for most of us in everyday life, murky and choppy, impossible to see to the bottom of. Jana is diving straight to the bottom when the water is completely still and crystal clear. So there aren't any brain scanners or electrodes, it's just the mind looking at itself in a state of unprecedented stillness. And what becomes visible there is what we are about to explore. To understand the Buddhist picture of consciousness, we first need to know where it sits in the Buddhist map of a person. Because the Buddha didn't just describe consciousness in isolation, he described the entire architecture of experience. According to the Buddha, everything that makes up what we call a person consists of 5 aggregates, heaps, or my favorite word for it, lumps, the 5 khandas. There is form, rupa, which is the physical dimension, the body, its sense organs, and the material world they make contact with. Then we have feeling tone, vedana. This isn't emotions exactly, it's the basic quality that accompanies every single moment of experience, which is always one of 3 feeling tones: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Then there's perception, saññā, recognition and identification, labeling. This is red. This is a dog. This is the smell of coffee. That function that categorizes raw experience. Interestingly, saññā is also what creates the distortions in perception, because we rarely see things freshly. We see them through the accumulated lens of everything we've already decided about the world, which connects rather neatly to Seth's controlled hallucination. His point is that the brain does exactly the same thing, perceiving through a model built from prior experience rather than seeing reality directly. Then we have mental formation, sankhara, the most complex one. This covers everything that arises alongside consciousness: intentions, emotions, habits, tendencies, volition, attention, effort. The Abhidhamma lists 52 mental factors under this heading. Crucially, this is where karma is made. When the Buddha said intention is karma, he was pointing at sankhara. 5th, consciousness, viññāṇaṁ, the knowing, the awareness, the experiencing of the other 4. So it's this 5th heap or lump or khanda that makes up a person that we're talking about today. But we can't really speak of a consciousness, viññāṇa, as one thing. Actually, it divides into 6 types. The first 5 are the sense consciousnesses: eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness. The 6th is mind consciousness, which both processes what the 5 sense consciousnesses deliver to it, but it can also take its own mental objects directly: thoughts, memories, concepts, emotions. It's the integrating, meaning-making dimension of the whole system. And all of them are conditioned, meaning all of them arise and cease depending on conditions, just like every other conditioned phenomenon we've talked about in this series so far. Each consciousness arises when three things come together: the sense organ, its corresponding object, and attention. So, for example, the eye meets a visible object like an apple plus attention. That's when eye consciousness arises. If they separate, it ceases. And the same goes for mind consciousness. Mind meets either a mental object, a thought, a memory, or it gets input from a sense consciousness plus attention, then mind consciousness arises. When they separate, it ceases. So none of the six are permanently on. So consciousness in this model is not sitting there permanently switched on like a light bulb. It's more like the light in a fridge. It only comes on when the door is opened. The sense organ, the eye, ear, nose, mouth, whatever, is the fridge. The sense object, what is seen, heard, felt, etc., is the hand opening the door, and consciousness is the light that appears. No door opening, no light. And the five sense consciousnesses are primarily receptive. Eye consciousness sees, ear consciousness hears, and so on, each carrying a basic feeling tone of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. But they don't recognize or evaluate. What happens next, almost instantaneously, is that mind consciousness takes up what they delivered and processes it further, naming, recognizing, reacting. It's a relay, rapid, seamless, but a relay nonetheless. So consciousness isn't a single unified spotlight. It's more like a rapid succession of moments, each one arising, doing its thing, passing away. So fast it feels continuous, but it isn't. Whether and how fully consciousness arises depends on the strength of the contact. There's a traditional illustration that I really like, an image of an insect landing on the surface of still water. And it lands so lightly that it practically doesn't disturb the water's surface. It's too small, too brief a contact for consciousness to fully arise. The contact was there, but insufficient. And this is what happens with the countless impressions that usually brush past our sense organs without registering. The hum of the air conditioning, the feel of our clothes against our skin, movement at the edge of vision. There's contact, but not enough to fully open the fridge door. Though I say usually deliberately, because for many neurodivergent people, particularly those with sensory processing differences, exactly these impressions do register fully and sometimes overwhelmingly. So the threshold at which contact becomes sufficient for consciousness to arise isn't the same for everyone. This is actually consistent with how the Buddhist model describes the sense faculties. The Canon acknowledges that the faculties vary in sharpness and sensitivity from person to person, and this affects what arises into consciousness. Whether that sensitivity is a gift, a challenge, or both rather depends on the day. You might be asking yourself, if consciousness arises through sense organs meeting objects, what about plants? They're alive. They respond to their environment. Are they conscious too? The canonical Theravāda answer is no. The Buddha made a clear distinction between sentient beings, beings with viññāṇaṁ, and plants which do have the life faculty, but not consciousness in the sense we mean. Plants respond to light, to damage, to their environment, but this is more like a biological program running than experience arising. There's no sense organ meeting a sense object, no attention, no feeling tone of pleasant or unpleasant. So nothing it's like to be a plant. This maps neatly onto current neuroscience, which holds that consciousness requires some form of nervous system capable of integrating information. Plants don't have one. So animals, yes. Plants, no. You can put down the guilt about the salad. Now, here's something remarkable from the Pali Canon. The Buddha's chief disciple Sariputta described the relationship between consciousness and nama rupa, name and form, or the mind-body complex, using this analogy. It's as if two sheaves of reeds were to stand leaning against one another. From name and form as a condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a condition comes name and form. Remove one sheaf, the other falls. Neither can stand alone. So within a lifetime, consciousness and the mind-body complex lean on each other in mutual dependence, neither one being the source of the other. It's two things in a relationship, each propping the other up, which is kind of lovely. Go team consciousness and mind-body complex. But, and this is important, this mutual dependence describes what happens within a life, in this realm. It's not saying consciousness is permanently bound to any particular body. The five sense consciousnesses cease at death. Their instruments, the sense organs, are gone. But mind consciousness is different. It doesn't need a physical organ because it also arises when it meets a purely mental object. And mental objects don't die with the body. The will to become again, the accumulated habits, wishes and intentions of a lifetime, all of that is still there, still arising, still giving mind consciousness something to land on and keep going. The stream continues because the fuel hasn't run out, and it won't run out until craving itself is extinguished. The two sheaves that lean on each other in this life fall apart, and then mind consciousness finds a new configuration in the next. This brings us back to the question my neuropsychology lecturer couldn't answer. Does the brain generate consciousness? And if so, how? The Buddhist answer is nope, it does not generate consciousness. The fact that brain activity and conscious experience happen at the same time doesn't mean one causes the other. That is correlation, not causation. Consciousness is simply not the kind of thing that can be measured. It isn't material. It has no weight, no charge, no location. Every instrument science has at its disposal is designed to detect and quantify physical phenomena, and consciousness isn't one of those. So, if consciousness can't be found in a brain scan, what is the brain actually doing with it? I think a radio gets us surprisingly close to the answer. It's a bit retro, I know, but bear with me. A radio receives a signal, and it shapes it, gives it audible form. A better radio produces clearer sound. A damaged radio distorts or loses the signal altogether. But the signal itself was never inside the radio, was never generated by the radio, and does not cease when the radio breaks. Different brains shape and express consciousness differently, like different radios, but they are not its source. The analogy, of course, stops short because an electromagnetic radio signal is physical and measurable. Frequency, amplitude, wavelength. Consciousness has none of those properties. It has no location, no measurable frequency, no material signature whatsoever, which makes it so incredibly mysterious and intriguing. So far, we've been talking about conditioned consciousness, the 6 types that arise and cease and that we all operate with. But here's where it gets really interesting. Buddhist teaching points beyond all of this to something that is different. In the Pali Canon, there is a phrase which I will now almost certainly mispronounce. Viññāṇaṁ, anidassanaṁ, anantam sabbato pavam. Consciousness without surface, without feature, radiant all around. Ajahn Sumedho draws on this enigmatic phrase and talks about pure consciousness, or sometimes just awareness, pure awareness, that is present underneath all the noise of conditioned experience. He says, consciousness isn't male or female. It doesn't have an age. It doesn't have a nationality. It isn't yours or mine. It doesn't have a good or a bad day. When you let go of all these identities, the roles, the opinions, stories, the sense of being a particular person with a particular history, what's left? Something that's still aware, still knowing, not nothing, not unconscious, but no longer personal. You might think, well, a newborn baby hasn't accumulated all those identities yet. Isn't a baby's consciousness like that then? But no, not quite. A baby's consciousness is preconditioned rather than unconditioned. It hasn't yet built up the layers of self-view, habit, identity that are then programmed into it by its parents, relatives, and culture. But it arrives already carrying the karmic seeds from previous lives, and it will rapidly develop all those layers. It's new, but not unconditioned or liberated in the Buddhist sense. What Ajahn Sumedho is pointing at is post-seeing through, arrived at not by never having developed a self, but by seeing clearly enough that it was constructed all along. And that is an entirely different thing. So the baby hasn't seen through the illusion, the meditator has. Ajahn Sumedho describes this pure awareness as a refuge, indestructible, not something that changes, not a creation, not an ideal. No matter how overwhelmed we feel, this awareness is never overwhelmed, stressed, or desperate. It simply is, which honestly I find very comforting. Ajahn Amaro brings in a related but slightly different teaching about what he calls unsupported consciousness. He describes it like this. Normally, conditioned consciousness is always landing somewhere. Sense object plus sense organ plus attention. It lands on a sight, a sound, a thought, a feeling. It finds a foothold. It settles. And wherever it settles, there is basis for more becoming, more clinging, and more suffering. But when the mind is fully released from clinging, which is the case for an arahant, someone who has realized enlightenment, when there is nothing intended, nothing acted upon, nothing lying latent, that consciousness has nothing left to land on. And having no basis to land, it is released, without feature, unsupported, radiant all round. Now, that's a very high bar. Most of us, to put it mildly, are not there. But here's the thing, this kind of conscious state can be glimpsed. Every genuine moment of letting go, every time you sit in meditation and the mind settles without grasping at anything, that's the potential for a taste of the same thing. Not the full realization, but the same direction, the same flavor. So when Ajahn Amaro talks about consciousness that doesn't land anywhere, don't file that away as something for someone else in some other lifetime. It's the direction every moment of genuine practice is already moving in. You may have touched it already without knowing what it was. Incidentally, this phrase about surfaceless, featureless, radiant consciousness is one of the most genuinely debated passages in all of Buddhist scholarship. Is this consciousness the same as nirvana, or is it a form of consciousness that experiences nirvana without being nirvana itself? Scholars disagree. Even the most accomplished teachers hold this with some uncertainty. Now I want to share something I found genuinely mind-boggling, a teaching on consciousness from Ajahn Lee Damodaro, who lived from 1907 to 1961. This talk was given in the last year of his life. The link is, of course, listed below. Ajahn Lee described the body as an entire inhabited world in miniature. The blood vessels are roads along which beings travel. Some of them have homes, families, meet each other, they argue, they make up. We are, from their perspective, a planet, a whole ecosystem. In other words, we host countless forms of conscious life in and on our bodies that we are entirely unaware of. I suppose he means the mites that live in our pores and our microbiome. Bacteria don't have a nervous system, so by the standard neuroscientific definition, they shouldn't be conscious. And yet they sense, they communicate, they coordinate, they respond to their environment in ways that look from the outside very much like conscious behavior. The Buddhist tradition says they are conscious. Neuroscience says probably not. Probably not surprisingly to you, I put my eggs in the Buddhist basket on this one. He goes further. He says there are also consciousnesses that don't have bodies, that attach themselves to us without our awareness. And that sometimes when we do things that are harmful or out of character, when we act in ways that make us wonder afterwards, that wasn't really me. What was that? That was likely not purely our own consciousness at work. It may have been the influence of these attached consciousnesses whose habits and inclinations temporarily pulled us along with them, which is a little bit, or maybe actually even very creepy. We can identify our own consciousness, Ajahn Lee says, because it's the one that is fundamentally loyal to us. It always has our best interests at heart. And then there's the question of how consciousness enters a new life. Ajahn Lee teaches that when a fetus begins to form, a gigantic number of consciousnesses compete for the opportunity to take hold. Because being born as a human is, in the scheme of things, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, pun intended, only the one with sufficient merit manages to latch on. The others fall away in huge numbers. Ajahn Lee doesn't say this explicitly, but when I heard this teaching, I immediately thought of fertilization. Millions of consciousnesses competing for a single foothold, just as millions of sperm compete to reach and penetrate a single egg. Whether that parallel is coincidence or something more, I'll leave for you to decide. Which brings us to something we've already touched on. What happens when the body dies? The Buddhist teaching is not that consciousness ceases at death, but it is also not that a fixed you, a soul, a personality, travels intact from one life to the next. What continues is a stream of consciousness, viññāṇaṁ, shaped by the habits, inclinations, intentions, and karma of the life just lived. It's like a river carrying silt from one landscape into the next. The silt shapes the new riverbed, but it is not the same river. This is why Buddhist rebirth is so careful to distinguish itself from what we usually mean by reincarnation, the idea of a fixed soul moving house. There is no fixed entity, there is a stream, fueled by the will to become, finding a new foothold, a new pairing of consciousness and name and form, the two sheaves of reeds leaning on each other, supporting each other into existence once more. We'll explore rebirth properly in its own video. For now, the key point is consciousness is not produced by the body and therefore is not ended by the body's death. The radio breaks, the signal, and maybe you could say the frequency to which it was tuned, continues. There is also, from an unexpected direction, some striking scientific support for this. Studies of near-death experiences have found consciousness apparently present, in some cases even heightened, in people in full cardiac arrest, with no measurable electrical activity in the brain, thinking, reasoning, memory, awareness, all apparently continuing without the physical substrate that is supposed to be generating them. This doesn't prove the Buddhist teaching, but it is a remarkable data point that science has often set aside because it doesn't fit with the materialist view, which is, if we're being honest, its very own form of view clinging. And it is precisely the kind of data point that Anil Seth's theory, which requires a functioning brain to generate experience, can't easily account for. One last thing, a lecturer I heard recently described humans as Earth's experiment in consciousness. And I understand the sentiment, but I don't think it's right. Consciousness has always been here. It's not our invention, not our monopoly. And what is unique about the human realm is something more specific. We have just enough suffering to want to transcend our situation, but not so much that we are completely overwhelmed by it, at least most of the time, I hope. So we have this incentive and capacity for self-reflection, the ability to turn consciousness back on itself and ask, what is this? What am I? Why does this hurt? We look at our own condition, our mortality, and back out at the cosmos, at the hundreds of billions of galaxies, at the almost incomprehensible fact that we are here at all briefly, asking questions, and we feel something that no other form of life, as far as we know, feels in quite the same way. A sense of profound mystery and sometimes a profound loneliness. We ask, why? What are we doing here? What is it all for? And maybe the fact that we can ask that question at all is the most extraordinary thing about human consciousness. In the Buddhist view, that capacity is an extraordinary opportunity, one that most forms of consciousness in most realms simply don't have. An opportunity to actually find the answers and to find a way out of suffering. So let's not waste it. To conclude, consciousness in the Buddhist picture is not a product of the brain. There are 6 types of conditioned consciousness, 5 sense consciousnesses registering raw experience, and mind consciousness processing what they deliver or working with its own mental objects. All 6 arise and cease depending on conditions. All 6 need an object, a surface to land on. The brain and conditioned consciousness lean on each other like 2 sheaves of reeds, mutually dependent, neither the source of the other. The brain is like an instrument, maybe a radio, through which conditioned consciousness operates in this sensory realm during a lifetime. But consciousness itself is something the radio receives and shapes, not something it generates. Beyond these 6 types of consciousness, the tradition points toward a change in consciousness that we all have the potential to realize, to uncover a knowing that has no surface to land on, that doesn't grasp, that doesn't settle. Ajahn Sumedho speaks of pure consciousness, identityless, ageless, genderless, not personal, already here but constantly overlooked, buried underneath the noise. Ajahn Amaro calls it unsupported consciousness. The Pali Canon calls it viññāṇaṁ, anidassanaṁ, consciousness without surface, radiant all round. And beyond even that, the destination this is all pointing toward is Nibbana itself, the unconditioned, not arising, not ceasing, the deathless, not a type of consciousness, but what consciousness of sufficient clarity and purity can finally know. And it was from that knowing, from that moment of seeing completely, that everything the Buddha taught about consciousness, suffering, the nature of reality came, using only his mind 2.5 millennia ago. To that I say, well done. And to Anil Seth, Baroness Greenfield, and anyone else who really wants to know what consciousness is and what the nature of reality actually is, I am convinced the answers can be found, but not by building better instruments. This is something that can't be measured externally. For that, we need to put the instruments down and turn attention inward and use what we already come equipped with as our investigative tool. And even if you're not convinced by what the Buddha said, the rather wonderful thing is that he never asked you to be. He always encouraged people to question everything, including what he said, and to find out for themselves through direct experience. Ultimately, it looks like you just have to walk the walk to find out. I'd love to know what you think about all of this. Please feel free to drop your theories and questions in the comments. Every like, every subscription, every comment is a huge motivator for me. So thank you for that. And that's it from me. The gelatinous blob in my skull has done its job for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.